Rich man forces black waitress to play piano to mock her, but her talent leaves him speechless. It was a warm Friday evening in the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. The upscale restaurant La Fontaine buzzed with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the soft footsteps of servers weaving through the dining room. The faint strains of jazz from a grand piano in the corner added to the ambiance of refined indulgence. Among the staff was Emily, a 27-year-old waitress with a quiet demeanor and a spark of determination in her eyes. To most patrons, she was just another face in uniform, but inside she carried dreams far bigger than the luxurious dining room around her. Emily's true passion wasn't serving tables, it was music. Ever since she was a child, the piano had been her refuge, a place where she could express every joy, sorrow, and unspoken thought. But dreams don't pay the bills, and working long shifts at La Fontaine was a necessity, a stepping stone toward the music conservatory she longed to attend. Few knew about her talent, except for the restaurant staff, who occasionally caught her stealing moments at the old upright piano in the back room during breaks. That night, as the evening rush began to settle, the door swung open, and in walked Victor Langston, a wealthy and arrogant entrepreneur, instantly recognizable by his sharp suits and air of superiority. Flanked by a few equally polished companions, Victor made an entrance like he owned the room. Known for his sharp tongue and penchant for spectacle, his presence made even the most seasoned staff stand a little straighter. Emily's colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Victor was not an easy guest. He thrived on pushing people's buttons. For Emily, though, he was just another table to manage in a long night's work. But this wasn't going to be a normal evening. As Victor scanned the room, his gaze landed on Emily. Something about her seemed to catch his attention. A momentary pause, then a smirk. Emily felt the weight of his stare but brushed it off, focusing instead on refilling water glasses and clearing plates. Victor, however, had already decided she was going to be his entertainment for the night. Emily had grown up in a small town in Georgia, where dreams of grandeur often felt as distant as the stars. Her mother, a single parent and tireless caregiver, had worked double shifts as a nurse to ensure Emily and her siblings had food on the table. Despite their modest means, music had always been a constant in their home. Her mother's old vinyl records and the out-of-tune piano gifted by a neighbor were the seeds of Emily's love for melody. That piano became her escape. While other kids played outside, Emily spent hours teaching herself to play, mimicking songs from the radio and venturing into classical pieces she found in second-hand music books. Her talent didn't go unnoticed. She played at church, school recitals, and community events, but recognition couldn't mask the financial hurdles that loomed over her dreams. By the time she turned 18, the reality was clear. A professional music career would have to wait. Scholarships didn't come through, and family responsibilities took precedence. Emily packed away her concert ambitions, replacing them with the practicality of earning a living. Yet, she couldn't entirely give up. The piano was more than a dream. It was her identity. When she moved to Raleigh a few years ago, Emily sought out a job at La Fontaine, not just because of the pay, but because of the grand piano tucked into the corner of the restaurant. Even though she rarely had time to play it, just knowing it was there gave her a sense of comfort. Music hadn't left her. It was simply waiting. That night, as Victor and his entourage took their seats, Emily approached their table, balancing a tray with practiced grace. Victor ordered a top-shelf scotch and cracked a joke loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Emily offered a polite smile as she took their orders, her voice steady despite the strange energy radiating from him. "Emily, huh?" Victor said, glancing at her name tag. "Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." The comment caught her off guard, but she nodded politely and stepped away to place their orders. She didn't notice the knowing grin he shared with his companions, nor the way his eyes followed her every move. But Victor wasn't just observing, he was planning, and Emily would soon find herself at the center of a spectacle she never asked for. The night carried on like any other, with the hum of laughter and silverware filling the room. Emily kept her pace steady, avoiding Victor's gaze as she moved between tables. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about him felt different, not just rude, but calculated. His presence loomed like a shadow, making her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite shake. By the time the appetizers were served, Victor had already started his performance, though not the kind Emily expected. He held court at his table, loudly recounting tales of his success and peppering in jabs about people who lacked ambition. His entourage laughed dutifully, while other diners shot annoyed glances in his direction. Emily tried to stay focused on her tasks, but as she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, Victor caught her off guard. "Tell me, Emily," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "what do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." His words stopped her mid-step. Emily hesitated, then gave a careful answer. "I play piano sometimes," she said softly, hoping to keep it brief. Victor's eyes lit up, and a sly smile curled across his lips. "A pianist, huh? How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance?" Emily froze. The room seemed to quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Victor wasn't about to let it go. "Nonsense," he declared, his voice booming. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." His companions chuckled, clearly enjoying the show. Other diners turned their heads, curious about the commotion. Emily's chest tightened. She could feel the heat of their stares, the silent judgment waiting to unfold. She wanted to say no, to walk away, but Victor's challenge hung in the air, daring her to rise to it or crumble under its weight. "I really shouldn't," Emily stammered, glancing around for support. But even her colleagues seemed hesitant to intervene. Victor leaned back in his chair, sipping his scotch with a smirk. "Ah, I see," he said mockingly. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words hit like a slap. Emily's hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't one to seek confrontation, but the way he dismissed her, like she was a joke, a nobody, cut deeper than she expected. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Never let anyone make you small, Emily. You're bigger than they'll ever know." A moment of silence stretched between them. Emily glanced at the piano, then back at Victor. His smug expression dared her to take the bait, and against her better judgment, she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but low. "I'll play." The room bristled with anticipation as Emily walked toward the piano, each step carrying the weight of both fear and defiance. The dining room seemed to hold its breath as she approached the gleaming grand piano. The soft glow of the chandelier above cast a spotlight on her, isolating her from the murmuring crowd. Her fingers trembled as she slid onto the bench, the polished keys gleaming like a challenge waiting to be met. Behind her, Victor leaned back in his chair, the picture of smug satisfaction, as though he had already won whatever game he was playing. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely think. This wasn't the church recital or the cozy community gatherings she'd once known. This was different. This was hostile. But there was no turning back now. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool surface beneath her fingertips. The first notes were soft, hesitant, almost fragile. A few diners shifted in their seats, and someone coughed in the back of the room. Emily ignored them, her focus sharpening as she leaned into the music. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Claude Debussy's Clair de Lune. The melody spilled into the room, weaving through the air like a thread, delicate but unyielding. As her confidence grew, the music swelled. Her hands moved with a grace that belied the chaos inside her, the notes pouring out like a confession. Each chord seemed to carry a piece of her story. The sacrifices her mother made, the nights she spent practicing in a cramped room, the weight of dreams deferred but never abandoned. The diners fell silent, their earlier chatter replaced by a collective stillness. Even Victor, who had been whispering to his companions, went quiet. Emily didn't need to look at him to feel the shift in the room. The mocking energy had dissipated, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps awe, perhaps humility. The music soared, and Emily let herself go. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't a waitress or a struggling dreamer. She was simply herself, an artist. Her fingers danced across the keys, drawing out emotions so raw and vivid they seemed to hang in the air like smoke. By the time she struck the final chord, the room was utterly still. For a moment there was no sound, just the lingering resonance of the piano. Emily sat frozen, her hands still resting on the keys, unsure of what would come next. Then, as though released from a spell, the audience erupted into applause. The sound was thunderous, reverberating off the walls and filling the room with a warmth Emily hadn't expected. Some diners stood, clapping with a fervor that brought tears to her eyes. Her coworkers, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in, their faces lit with pride. Victor, however, remained seated. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression Emily couldn't quite decipher, part shock, part discomfort. He raised his hands and clapped slowly, a hollow sound compared to the cheers around him. But even his hesitant applause couldn't overshadow what Emily had just done. She had reclaimed her voice, and no amount of condescension could take that away. As the applause began to fade, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Emily slowly stood, her knees still trembling, but her back straight. She glanced around, and for the first time that evening, she truly saw the people watching her, not as spectators, but as witnesses. Their expressions carried something new: admiration, respect, and even a hint of awe. She didn't look at Victor right away. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod to the diners who had clapped the loudest, her lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't pride she felt, but relief. Relief that she hadn't let fear silence her. But then, as though magnetized, her gaze shifted to Victor. He was still seated, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. The confident smirk he'd worn so brazenly earlier was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face was a mask of forced neutrality, as though he couldn't decide whether to admit his misstep or double down on his arrogance. "Well," Victor finally said, his voice louder than it needed to be, breaking the fragile silence that had settled over the room. "That was unexpected." He chuckled lightly, though it lacked its usual bravado. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places." The comment landed like a dull thud. His companions exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant to be an olive branch, but they were hollow, weighed down by his inability to truly own the moment. "Thank you," Emily said, her tone steady and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but no hostility either. She wasn't about to let him pull her back into the smallness he'd tried to impose. Her performance had spoken louder than any rebuttal she could offer. Victor cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective gaze. He gestured toward the waiter for another drink, a flimsy attempt to regain his composure. "You've got quite a gift," he added, almost begrudgingly. Emily nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "Everyone has a gift," she said, the weight of her words deliberate. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room seemed to hold its breath again, the subtle sting of her response rippling through the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was enough. Victor shifted in his seat, his usual air of dominance slipping further with each passing second. The diners began to turn their attention back to their meals, though the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Where there had once been the quiet hum of privilege and pretense, there was now something richer. A shared understanding, perhaps even respect, for the waitress who had reminded everyone of the power of authenticity. But Victor wasn't just humiliated, he was exposed, and no amount of charm could shield him from the truth everyone in the room now saw. Emily stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement as she returned to her station. She still had a job to finish, but something about her posture had changed. Her head was held a little higher, her movements more deliberate. Victor's table had quieted. His entourage, who had laughed so freely at her expense earlier, now avoided eye contact, their conversation subdued. The bravado that once filled their corner of the restaurant had evaporated, leaving only an awkward silence in its place. The night continued, but Emily felt lighter. Each step she took through the dining room felt more purposeful, her confidence blooming in a way she hadn't expected. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, patrons stopped her to offer kind words. "You're incredible," one older woman said softly as Emily set down a coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Keep going. You've got something special," another man added. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Emily thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were validations of everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of becoming. Victor, however, was not so gracious. As Emily approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her with an expression that teetered between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his tone clipped. "No need to rub it in." Emily paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I just wanted to play." Victor had no response. He fidgeted with his drink, his once commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone at the table knew it. As Victor scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, looked at Emily and said, "You were amazing, truly." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of humanity in a group she had written off as shallow. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. The night ended with Victor and his group leaving quietly, their usual grand exit replaced by a hasty retreat. Emily watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Victor anymore. Her mind was already on the next step. The tips from that night were unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra for piano lessons she'd been postponing. As she locked up and walked home, the crisp air filling her lungs, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years: certainty. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist, and nothing, not mocking words, not financial struggles, not fear, could take that away from her. But as she walked, her thoughts weren't on the night's conflict. They were on the future, where her dreams finally felt closer than ever. Emily sat on the worn bench in her small apartment, her fingers gliding over the keys of her old upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, just as it always had. That night, something had shifted within her. Not just a moment of triumph, but a realization that her talent wasn't something she needed to hide or justify. It was hers, and it was enough. In the days that followed, the events at the restaurant became something of a local story. Patrons who had witnessed her performance shared the tale, and word began to spread. A few days later, Emily received a call from a man who had been dining that night, a music producer visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but a chance to record a demo, a step toward something she had only dared to dream of. Emily agreed, not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, one she wasn't afraid to walk through. For years, she had let fear and doubt whisper lies into her mind, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. But now she saw the truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The incident with Victor Langston wasn't just a humiliating spectacle turned victory. It was a reminder of the power of integrity. Victor, for all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she silenced him with nothing but the purity of her craft. To anyone watching her story, Emily's message was clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of Victor Langstons, people who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But true power comes from staying rooted in who you are and letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As she closed the piano lid and rested her hands on the faded wood, Emily smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back on because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Victor to test you. Take your step forward now. If Emily's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph.